Hey everybody, Aaron Cowan, Sage Dynamics. This week's questions answered video, the question was, what are my thoughts on governmental gun confiscation? Obviously, with an election just around the corner, this is a big concern. Concern varies from individual to individual, how invested they are in their Second Amendment. We have a Second Amendment which grants our rights to keep and bear arms, so gun confiscation, as some people are imagining, is just impossible. More than likely, they're going to have to try to pass laws to repeal the Second Amendment or do what they've been doing for, well, the past 100 years and continue to chip away at what the Second Amendment recognizes. So those Supreme Court nominations are definitely a huge deal because cases that go to the Supreme Court, if a Supreme Court, the sitting Supreme Court is more progressive or liberal, whatever term you want to use, and conservative or Republican or whatever term you want to use, then our gun rights are definitely at a bigger risk. But the question was more posed as to me being a law enforcement. I'm a reserve law enforcement officer. I left full-time law enforcement last year. What do I think about the government coming and taking my guns? Well, it's actually logistically impossible, and I'm going to show you how. So just to prove my point, we're going to look at some raw numbers. Now, before I get into this, there's a great article written by Paul Howe. You can find it on the internet. If I can find a link for it, I'll put it in the comments section. He lays basically the same case I'm about to lay, but I'm going to do it for the sake of the video. You have 120,000 full-time federal law enforcement agents in the United States that are either, they have subject matter jurisdictions such as like the FBI or the ATF or the DEA, or they have territorial jurisdictions such as the Department of Defense Civilian Police or U.S. Park Police. They have an area in which they're responsible for the enforcement of law. Now you have 1.1 million state, local, municipal law enforcement officers, but only 765,000 of that are sworn, which means cops with arresting powers. So those other numbers represent non-sworn positions such as admin or clerks or so on and so forth. Then you have 100,000 reserve or part-time officers, but only 44,000 of that are sworn positions with arresting powers. Thinking about cities, depending on where you're watching this from, you may live in a city, you may live in a small town. Generally, cities with a population above 400,000 tend to have a full-time SWAT team, which means the higher your city's population, the more likely you are to have a full-time SWAT team. In places where there's a lot of smaller cities really close to each other, like the greater Los Angeles area, a lot of those smaller towns, such as 200,000, may be butted up against 600,000, and there's enough tax revenue to justify a full-time SWAT team. So let's just say, for the sake of argument, because it's really hard to pin down the actual number, you've got 46 full-time SWAT teams nationwide. When in the actuality, the number is much higher than that, especially if you account for municipalities or cities that also have full-time narcotics teams, which can also serve warrants, because ultimately that's where we're going with this conversation. So just in law enforcement, you got some pretty impressive numbers. Now, worst case scenario, without putting too much tinfoil underneath my hat, let's look at the military. If they were going to use the military. You've got 1,281,900 active duty military in the United States Armed Forces. That's all the branches. And then you've got 801,200 reserve components. That includes the National Guard. Your grand total between military and law enforcement is 3,283,100. That is a very, very large force with which to confiscate guns if such a thing was going to occur. Until you really think about just how many guns there are. Now, in the US, there are, as of the most recent date on it, 14.5 million concealed carry licenses, whether it's called a CCW or CPL. It's different from state to state. That's nationwide. In fact, under the Obama administration, it increased exponentially. There's really no wonder why. So 11 states have constitutional carry. You're not required to have a permit, so there's no way of really knowing how many people in those states are carrying concealed weapons. And the reason I bring up concealed weapons in general is people who carry concealed own at least one gun, so that's a metric in which we can track people who actively use firearms for self-defense or carry one for self-defense. Now, how many guns are in the US? Some recent data said there's 300 million firearms in the United States. Now, people are going to own more than one gun, so you can't say there's 300 million gun owners in the United States, but I think we can use that one number. Let's just use that number of CCWs, 14.5 million versus 3,283,100. But that 3 million number is actually too high because I seriously doubt that even a fraction of that number would take an illegal order from their chain of command and act on it. That order being, go out and confiscate the guns. Even if there was an executive order or anything like that, it's still an illegal command. Now, there is an oath, and that oath says that you will obey your leadership. But the very first thing that you're supposed to obey is the Constitution. Second Amendment is part of the Constitution. Now, even supposing that all 300 million and change individuals went out and started seizing guns, how long do you think it would take them to seize 14.5 million guns? We already know there's more guns than that, but they got to go, let's just say for the sake of argument, they have to go to 14.5 million homes. How many warrants, gun seizure warrants, do you think a SWAT team could serve in a day? 2, maybe 3? Get the military involved. And keep in mind that number includes non-sworn personnel too, so you've literally got clerks and dispatchers out there like kicking in doors. Logistically, it's just impossible for the government to go out and take your guns. It's just not feasible for them to physically come to your house and be like, give us your guns. Now, on a state basis, maybe, probably. You look at California. Is it possible for California to organize, because they got CHP and a bunch of different law enforcement agencies, they got their National Guard. Yeah, they could try it, but they're always going to run into the same problem. And that problem is people who take their oath to the Constitution, their oath of service, and their oath to their country extremely seriously, like I do. My belief has always been, the way that I interpret the oath for my own personal moral and ethics has been, my job as a law enforcement officer is to protect the rights of the people, not to enforce laws. My primary mission as a law enforcement officer is to protect the rights of the people. I protect their rights by enforcing laws. However, if a law creates a victim and creates a criminal, then it's not really enforcement, and it's not really, I'd say, in keeping with the oath that I took as a law enforcement officer. So if someone were to tell me, hey, we're gonna go seize guns, I'd be like, who's this we? Because it ain't me. In fact, I'm probably gonna find out where you're going, I'm gonna go over there and I'm gonna try and stop you. Because it's unconstitutional for you to try to disarm the American populace. This is not anything other than that as far as this conversation goes, because again, there's a lot of tinfoil involved in this conversation. But if you think that our government can't become usurpacious, then you haven't been paying attention. It's very possible in the near future that we could have a hypothetical conversation in this, because they always want to talk about we need to have a common sense conversation about gun control. What if they started leaning that conversation more and more towards mandatory turn-ins? Instead of saying, we're going to come get your guns, they're going to say, no, you're going to bring them to us. If you look at what they did in Australia, they look at what they did in the United Kingdom, it's much more possible and feasible, and there's evidence to the fact that that's how it would go. They'll literally make you turn them in, and they'll pick off those who decide not to turn in their guns one by one as they catch them through however many investigative procedures, or just happenstance when they happen to arrive at a scene for a separated call and be like, is that a gun? You're not supposed to have that. So, confiscation by force is highly improbable. And if, for whatever reason, confiscation by force happened, I wouldn't participate in it. I would be against it. I don't really know any way to speak more clear on that matter. For those of you that are on the fence about law enforcement, please understand, if you don't know a cop, please go out and get to know a cop. And I know this is a really, really raw conversation for a lot of people, because everybody's had a bad experience with law enforcement, myself included. I've had bad experiences with law enforcement while I was law enforcement, and they knew I was law enforcement, because I've dealt with cops who had no business being cops. But they are the exception, and there's no profession that is 100% foolproof. Now granted, police are a little more visible in our lives because they do administer remedies for crimes committed. So if you speed, you get a ticket, and that leaves you with an unfavorable impression of that officer that he didn't give you a break for whatever reason, and I get that. I don't honestly believe in levying fines for operating a vehicle over a certain speed, because I feel like that's really charging you with a possible grievous crime in which no grievous crime committed. That you were just speeding, you didn't crash, and no other crime in the system will we really do that to that degree. But separate conversation. Police officers are people too, and I'm sure you've heard that before. But get to know a cop and realize that the number of cops that would drink the Kool-Aid and go out and seize your guns is really, really, really small. And those same officers would have to deal with the officers that wouldn't be willing to go along with that. Military is no different. Like, yeah, you may be able to convince the lower ranking guys that, like, this is what the American people need, and we're going to go out and seize some guns from these unruly rednecks, but the further you go up in the leadership chain, especially senior NCOs and guys that are, have a really good seasoned career, they're going to look at that and be like, no, sir, this is an unconstitutional law and I'm not supposed to follow those. I can't think of a way to be any more straightforward on the topic. Me speaking as a law enforcement officer, I wouldn't participate in a gun confiscation. I would do everything that I could to stop it. Realistically, went over it. It's kind of physically and logistically impossible for them to do a forced confiscation. They would do a mandatory turn-in. I wouldn't participate in that either because I don't have to. Laws are recognized by a civil society. If a law is unjust, then society's job is to not recognize it. And we're not just talking about the Second Amendment. There's some other ridiculous stuff out there that the government has just given itself the ability to give itself more power without the acquiescence of the people. So basically, by their own machinations and their own creations and their own makings, they're able to continue to vote themselves into a higher and higher position of power, whereas the people seem to be, in the states especially, seem to be losing more and more power over the day-to-day operations and the day-to-day effects on people's lives than they normally would have. I hope that answers your question. I don't really know what else I can say on the subject. And again, it's just that time of year, that time of every 4 years that we start worrying about this stuff more and more and more and more. People start panic buying, ammo starts running out. And there are some pessimists who say, well, every single time nothing happens. Well, eventually something's going to happen. It's just a matter of what and to what degree severity it's going to be. But we definitely need to stay vigilant. And we definitely need to become more involved. And we need to start pushing back in a way that's going to give us a stronger voice when it comes time for our elected officials to bargain with our rights. Because my right to own a firearm isn't a bargaining chip, and it shouldn't be used as a bargaining chip. And a guy that I voted for doesn't necessarily have the right to speak on my behalf without first asking me if it's okay for him to do something that I didn't want him to do when I voted for him. I'm Aaron Count with Sage Dynamics. Vote accordingly.